You're watching a heavy, balding man in a golf shirt ride an airport shuttle toward his gate. August 23, 2001. Washington Dulles, mid-afternoon. He has a duffel bag on one shoulder and a ticket to Switzerland that he bought 12 days ago. He is 38 years old. He is a father of 4 from Bowie, Maryland. He served 20 years in the United States Air Force and retired as a master sergeant. And at his trial, prosecutors will tell a jury he is carrying roughly $117,000 in credit card debt. He is also carrying, according to court records, the addresses of foreign embassies in Europe. One of them belongs to Iraq. One of them belongs to China. One of those pieces of paper is not in his bag. It is not in his wallet. It is inside his shoe. In his pocket, there is a small spiral pad with 13 words written on it that have nothing to do with each other. In his duffel, there are 4 sheets of handwritten 3-digit numbers. In his wallet, there is a line that begins with the characters 5, 6, N, V, O, A, I, and means nothing to anyone alive except him. 2 men step onto the shuttle. One of them lifts a badge to eye level. The man in the golf shirt stops moving. He does not run. He does not shout. Witnesses to the moment describe him, reportedly, as simply dazed. The look of a man whose arithmetic has just come out wrong for the first time. What was in his shoe is the smallest thing the FBI found that day. Here's the part that took 2 more years. The man on that shuttle had already carried more classified paper out of a secure building than any spy in American history, by the reckoning of the journalists and officials who worked the case. The largest theft of United States government secrets until a contractor named Edward Snow walked out of Hawaii with a hard drive. Over 20,000 pages classified top secret or higher. CD-ROMs, videotapes, satellite imagery, early warning systems, weapons of mass destruction. He had offered it to 3 governments, and the price on his own letter was $13 million. And almost none of it was in his house. He had buried it. In garbage bags and Tupperware containers, 18 inches down. In public parks, where families walked their dogs on Sundays. To find those packages, the FBI needed to break his code. He was a trained cryptographer, and the codes he built were good enough that the Bureau's best codebreaker would spend months on them. They didn't break him with a supercomputer. They didn't break him with a wiretap or a defector. They broke him because he couldn't spell. That's not a joke, and it isn't a nickname invented by a headline writer. It is the mechanism of the case. 9 misspelled words on a code sheet put a name on him, and 2 years later, the last secret he had left, the one he had hidden so well he couldn't find it himself, was unlocked by a single word written by hand in a book he had been carrying around since junior high school. To understand how that happens, you have to go back to a classroom on Long Island and a boy being asked to spell a word out loud. Brian Patrick Regan was born in Queens on October 23, 1962, raised Catholic, and grew up on Long Island in a house where nobody had a word for what was wrong with him. Because in the 1960s and 70s, in an ordinary American public school, there was no word. There was only a boy who could not read the way other boys read. Letters arrived in the wrong order. Words he had written 100 times came out mangled the 101st. He was placed in the slow classes. He was called stupid out loud by children and reportedly by adults. And he learned the specific survival skill of every dyslexic kid in that era. Sit at the back, keep your paper covered, and never volunteer. He was not stupid. That is the part that matters. His problem was not intelligence, it was decoding. He could look at a pattern and see the shape of it faster than the people grading him. What he could not do was spell. He went on to Farmingdale High School, and somewhere in those years, he kept a book that every American schoolchild is handed, and nobody thinks about again. A junior high yearbook. Rows of small photographs, jokes scribbled in the margins by children. In it, there is a gag photograph of a classmate wearing a mask, and underneath it, in somebody's handwriting, a name. Remember that yearbook. It comes back at the very end of this story, and when it does, it will have cost the United States government 2 years of digging. The author who spent the most time inside this case, Yudhijit Bhattacharjee, put it plainly. Regan's confidence was completely squashed at an early age. So, in August of 1980, at 17, Brian Regan did what a lot of boys like that did. He joined the Air Force. And the Air Force did something no school had ever done for him. It gave him a job that ran on exactly the thing he was good at. He was put into signals intelligence, which means, stripped of jargon, sit in a room, look at streams of intercepted noise and imagery, and find the pattern. Which radar just changed frequency? Which vehicle just moved? Which shape in a satellite photograph is a tarpaulin and which is a missile? Regan was good at it. Not adequate, good. He rose steadily through a career field crowded with very bright people, and by the 1990s he was a master sergeant, an E7, a senior enlisted analyst trusted with the country's most sensitive imagery. In 1984, in Texas, at 21 years old, he married a Swedish woman named Annette Stenqvist, who had come to America as a tourist and stayed. They had 4 children. They settled eventually in Bowie, Maryland, a commuter town where every second driveway belongs to somebody with a security clearance. On paper, he had built something, 20 years of service, a specialty the government needed, a wife, 4 kids, a house. There was one thing he never fixed, and one thing he never stopped doing. He never learned to spell, and he never lost the childhood habit of breaking a rule quietly just to prove he could get away with it. As a boy, reportedly stealing tools from a neighbor. As a recruit, reportedly cheating on his entrance exam. The lesson he took from both was not that it was wrong. The lesson he took was that nobody noticed. In July of 1995, Master Sergeant Brian Regan was detailed to the National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia. Most Americans have never heard of the NRO, which is roughly the point of it. It is the agency that builds and flies America's spy satellites. Its headquarters is a set of mirrored glass blocks off a highway in northern Virginia that, for years, had no sign on it. Regan was assigned to an office responsible for focusing signals intelligence support for tactically deployed military units. In plain English, making sure that a pilot or a battalion about to go somewhere dangerous knew what the satellites had seen. To do that job, he was given a password to IntelLink. IntelLink was the intelligence community's own internal internet, a classified network where the CIA, the NSA, the NRO, and the military services posted their finished product. Satellite photographs with coordinates burned into them, assessments of which foreign general was drinking, handbooks on how an adversary hides a missile launcher from an American satellite, and how to find it anyway. It was a library of everything the United States knew, searchable 24 hours a day from a chair. And it had one built-in defense, which nobody in that building thought about very much, because it was designed to be boring. IntelLink kept an audit trail, every login, every logout, every search term, every document pulled by which terminal at what minute. A room full of America's secrets with a librarian who never blinks and never forgets who took what off the shelf. Regan sat down at that terminal in 1995. For 4 years, he did his job. Then, in the middle of 1999, he started looking at things that had nothing to do with him. Here is what was happening at his kitchen table. Brian Regan was a master sergeant with 4 children, a mortgage, and a wife whose marriage to him was reportedly coming apart. His pay was fixed by a table published by Congress. His debts were not fixed by anything. By the time the FBI got around to pulling his credit, the sworn affidavit in his case put his consumer debts at $53,000 as of February 2001. By the time prosecutors stood up in front of a jury 2 years later, the number they used was about $117,000. Either figure is the same story. A man in a house he was losing the ability to pay for. And the clock on his career was running out. 20 years of service means retirement, and retirement was coming in 2000. He had been passed over. He was facing, reportedly, the prospect of a mandatory overseas assignment. He had spent 2 decades becoming excellent at one thing, and he was about to be pushed out into a civilian job market where he believed, a belief planted in a classroom in 1972, that a man who couldn't write a clean paragraph would never be hired to do anything serious. He was surrounded every working day by the most valuable inventory on earth, photographs that governments would pay in cash, in millions, without asking a single question. He did the arithmetic. Everybody does the arithmetic. The difference is that in the autumn of 1999, Brian Regan started printing. Not a document. Hundreds of them. He printed on the office printers, in a building where thousands of pages of classified paper move every day, and he walked them to a locked cupboard wedged in the space between his cubicle and his neighbor's. That was his warehouse. Sheet by sheet, week by week, the cupboard filled with imagery, coordinates, assessments, capability studies on Iraq, on Iran, on Libya, on China. None of it his business, all of it his to see. And then, reportedly, the building's own maintenance staff drilled the cupboard open. Think about what should have happened next. A locked cupboard on a secure floor, forced open, hundreds of top-secret pages inside with no cover sheets, no log, no reason to exist. That is a security incident. That is the end of somebody's career and the beginning of a polygraph. What happened instead is that Brian Regan walked over, said the documents were his, and carried them away. Nobody escalated it. Nobody wrote it up in a way that stuck. He moved the pile to an overhead cabinet. Then he began moving it, load by load, out of the building and into the basement of his house in Bowie, Maryland, where 20,000 pages of American secrets sat under the floor his children walked on. A basement is a terrible hiding place. He knew that, so he built something better. Here is the machine he built. It has two halves, and this is the only time I'm going to explain it, so stay with me. The first half was the ground. Regan bought a handheld GPS receiver in 2000, a consumer gadget the size of a TV remote. He drove out to public parks, Patapsco Valley State Park in the woods above Baltimore, Pocahontas State Park south of Richmond. He walked off the trails with a shovel and a load of paper wrapped in garbage bags, thin plastic, and Tupperware containers, and he dug holes roughly 18 inches deep. Documents, videotapes, CDs, photographs, buried in 19 separate places across 2 states over about 3 years. Then he stood over each hole and let the GPS tell him where he was, to the second of latitude and longitude. The second half was the paper. Those coordinates went into notebooks, but not as numbers. Regan had been trained in cryptography by the United States Air Force, and he layered his systems like a professional. He built brevity codes, 2-letter pairs that each stood for a whole word, so a sentence became a string of initials. He built cipher sheets that turned those initials into long alphanumeric strings. For short things like addresses, he used the oldest trick there is, a shift of 1 letter. Write B where you mean A. And for the most valuable secret he owned, the location of the packages themselves, he used a book cipher. Sheets of 3-digit numbers, each number pointing to a word on a page in a book. Distances, tree references, turn left at the 3rd oak. A book cipher is close to unbreakable, and the reason is beautiful. The numbers are useless without the book. There is no mathematics that gets you in. You need the object off the shelf. Regan chose his book, encoded his 19 holes, and folded the numbers into his notes. He also wrote out the master list of locations on a single sheet of paper, put that sheet inside a plastic toothbrush holder, and buried the toothbrush holder under an interstate exit sign near Fredericksburg, Virginia. 20,000 pages of top-secret material, in the dirt, in 19 places, findable only by a man with a GPS and a code, and a toothbrush holder buried beside I-95. Now he needed a customer. In April of 2000, Brian Regan sat down and wrote a letter to the intelligence service of Libya. It reportedly ran 13 pages, encrypted. In it, according to accounts of the case file, he identified himself falsely as a CIA analyst, which was the first lie and not the last. He offered classified United States material for sale. His price was $13 million. And then he did something that tells you exactly who he was. He wrote out the tradecraft. Instructions. Libya was to establish a toll-free 1-800 number for him to call. Confirmation that they had done it was to be published in the classified advertisements of the Washington Post as an advertisement for a used car. That is not the fantasy of a man who has watched a film. That is a man who has spent 20 years reading other people's operational traffic and knows how it's done. He split the material across 3 separate envelopes so that no single interception would give anyone the whole system. One envelope with the coded letter, one with the instructions for decoding it, one with the code sheets themselves. He included a sample of the merchandise, 23 pages of real documents stamped secret and top secret, so the buyer would know he wasn't bluffing. He thought about interception. He thought about deniability. He thought about the classified ads in the post. He did not, reportedly, run a spell check. On August 31, 2000, Master Sergeant Brian Patrick Regan retired from the United States Air Force after 20 years and 1 month of service. Somewhere in a drawer there is a certificate. 6 weeks later, he was hired by TRW, a large defense contractor, and TRW sent him back to the National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia. Same building, same corridors, same terminals. That is not a plot twist. It's just how the American security state works. The man walks out the door as a sergeant on Thursday and back in on Monday with a contractor badge, and the clearance follows him like a dog. He also, on August 3, 2000, created an email account under a name that was not his, Stephen Jacobs, and over the following months, he logged into it 9 times. He was now a civilian with a wife, 4 kids, $100,000 of debt, a basement he had emptied into the woods, 19 holes in 2 state parks, a code, a toothbrush holder buried under a road sign, and an offer of $13 million sitting in the hands of the Libyan government. And nothing happened. Weeks passed. No 1-800 number. No used car advertisement in the Washington Post. Because his letter never got where he thought it went. In December of 2000, an FBI special agent named Stephen Carr in the Bureau's Washington field office was handed a package that had come down from FBI New York. Carr was 38, the same age as the man he was about to spend 2 years hunting, and is described by people who worked the case as thoughtful, intense, and meticulous to the point of irritation. Inside the package were envelopes that a source at the Libyan consulate had quietly handed to the United States government instead of forwarding to Tripoli. Carr opened them on his desk. The first held a 4-page letter, 149 lines of typed letters and numbers in blocks with no words in it at all. The second held instructions for decoding the first. The third held 2 sets of code sheets, ciphers, and a long list of 2-letter brevity codes with their meanings written out beside them. And then there were 23 pages that needed no decoding whatsoever, because they were photocopies of the real thing, and across the top of them were the words secret and top secret. Somewhere inside the United States intelligence community, a person with current access was selling everything. Carr had no name, no face, no city. He had a stack of paper with no words in it. And then he read the code sheets, the one page where the author had been forced to write in plain English, and he found the first thing in the whole case that was undeniably human. The code sheets were misspelled. Not once. Everywhere. Written out in the sender's own hand so that a Libyan intelligence officer would know what the 2-letter pairs meant was a vocabulary list of an intelligence professional, and it was spelled like a child's homework. Anonymous was written anonymous. Allegations was allegations. Precaution was precaution. Association was association. Negotiable came out negotiable, which is not a near miss. That is a word being fought. Neutralize was neutralize. Airborne was airborne. Confirmed was confirmed. Reveal was reveal. In the letters and notes tied to the case, there were more. Espionage spelled espionage. Imprisoned spelled imprisoned. Receive spelled receive. Countries spelled countries. And Libya, the country he was writing to, the word he must have typed 20 times, reportedly spelled Libya. Carr sat with it. Everything else about this man screamed discipline. 3 envelopes, a shift cipher, a dead drop advertisement in a newspaper, a false CIA identity, and then this. A man who had thought about counter-surveillance and had not thought about the letter S. That gave Carr something better than a fingerprint. Fingerprints only work if you already have the man. This was a filter. Somewhere in a population of thousands of cleared Americans, he was looking for a terrible speller. Remember those 9 words. They come back twice. While Carr worked the paper, the code went to a man in the FBI laboratory named Daniel Olson. Olson ran the Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, a small, unglamorous office that is, in practice, the last place in American law enforcement where a message goes when nobody else can read it. Most of Olson's career was spent on prison gangs, cell block ciphers scratched on toilet paper, murder orders hidden inside Bible verses. There is a detail about Dan Olson that is almost too neat to be true, and it is reported by the author who interviewed him. Olson has dyscalculia, the numerical mirror image of dyslexia. Numbers slip and reverse in his head the way letters did in Reagan's. The FBI's greatest breaker of numerical codes reportedly cannot reliably do arithmetic in his head. So, a man whose brain scrambles numbers sat down with 149 lines of numbers written by a man whose brain scrambled letters. Olson began with frequency, how often each group appears, which patterns repeat, where the seams are, and he had an advantage the author of the code had handed him for free: the code sheets. The sender, terrified of being misunderstood by a foreign service, had mailed the FBI his own dictionary. Olson started pulling plain text out of the blocks. It came out crooked and strange, and at first that looked like an error in his method. It wasn't. The plain text underneath was misspelled too, which means Olson was reading a confession before anyone knew whose it was. Now Carr had to convert a filter into a name, and for that he went to the boring defense nobody in the NRO ever thought about. The 23 sample pages were real, finished intelligence products. Every one of them had lived on IntelliLink, and IntelliLink, being a library, had kept its records. Which terminal requested which document, on which date, at which minute. So Carr did the least dramatic and most lethal thing in the entire case. He took his sample documents, sent the list into the system, and asked which computers in the United States government had pulled that exact combination of files on those exact days. 2 of the hits came back from the National Reconnaissance Office. He also mapped the letters themselves. Some of the sender's research had been done on public library computers, and those addresses clustered in a small patch of Maryland, around Bowie and Crofton, a short drive from Fort Meade, which told Carr something about culture, not just geography. The operational style in those letters was military, not agency. The man calling himself a CIA analyst was almost certainly nothing of the kind. A pool of thousands became a pool of a few hundred, then a few dozen. Then, working NRO personnel files against the profile, signals background, access to that specific imagery, financial distress, and a documented reputation as a bad writer, the pool became one name: a retired master sergeant. Back in the building as a contractor, Bowie, Maryland, Brian Patrick Regan. Now they had to prove it, and the proof was sitting in his own workspace. In April 2001, the FBI searched Regan's office and his NRO computer. They found his files, his drafts, his notes, ordinary work product by an ordinary employee, saved on a government machine. And they found the same misspellings, not similar, the same. The identical private mangling of the same words, in a man's own documents on a government network, matching a code sheet mailed to the Libyan consulate. Agents also, reportedly, went through his Dodge minivan in the office car park and found pages of coded messages, and a single page that appeared to be a decryption key. Carr now believed, with the specific certainty of a man who has stopped guessing, that the seller was Regan. He also had almost nothing a jury could convict on. Bad spelling is not a crime. Debt is not a crime. Looking at documents you are cleared to look at is not a crime. Regan had not yet handed a single classified page to a single foreign officer, which meant the FBI's problem had just inverted. They no longer needed to find him. They needed to catch him doing it, so they started watching him, and on May 23, 2001, Brian Regan showed them what he thought surveillance looked like. He left TRW's offices in Chantilly and began to drive badly on purpose, swerving across lanes, changing speed for no reason. He went to Manassas National Battlefield Park, Civil War ground, wide open, thin traffic, and pulled onto a dirt road where he could sit and watch his own back trail. Then he got out, walked into the trees, and left a small stack of magazines on the ground. Mad Magazine, the satirical comic with the gap-toothed boy on the cover. He drove away. Later, he came back, walked to the same spot, and picked them up. The magazines were still there. Nobody had touched them. Therefore, in his reasoning, nobody was following him. Leaving comics in a forest is not illegal. There is no statute. But it is the behavior of a man rehearsing a dead drop. And one of the surveillance specialists on him that day, a man the team called Smitty, reportedly radioed in the only line anybody remembers from that afternoon. "We've got a live one." He had just performed his own counter-surveillance test in front of the counter-surveillance team and passed it. If this were a film, this is the part where it ends, right here. The FBI has identified their man in under 6 months from a stack of paper with no words in it. They have his handwriting, his misspellings, his terminal logs, his debts, a decryption key from his van, and video of him practicing tradecraft in a national park. That is the arrest scene. Agents on a lawn in Bowie, Maryland at 6 in the morning. Credits. It did not happen. And the reason is the single most uncomfortable fact in this case. Everything the FBI had proved Brian Regan wanted to commit espionage. None of it proved he had. Attempted espionage under the statute needs an act, a real step toward real delivery. And Regan's only completed act so far had been mailing a letter that never arrived. Arrest him in June 2001 and you get a bad spelling case against a man in debt. And the 20,000 pages, they stay in the ground forever. 19 holes across 2 states, encoded in a book nobody can identify, under trees nobody has counted. So the Bureau made the decision that every counterintelligence service dreads. They let him keep going. He kept going immediately. On June 13th and again on June 24th, 2001, Regan drove to public libraries and sat down at computers that belonged to nobody. The kind of terminal with no login, no badge, no audit trail, and a queue of teenagers waiting behind you. According to court records, what he searched for there were the addresses of foreign diplomatic offices in Europe. On June 21st, he sent an email containing an encryption key. Think about what that does to the men watching him. A key is the last thing you send before the message. A key means a channel is about to open. 3 days after that, on June 26th, Brian Regan flew to Germany. He landed in Munich. He was out of the United States, out of reach of an American warrant, in a country full of embassies belonging to the governments he had written to, and the FBI cannot follow a man through the front door of a foreign consulate. For 7 days, the entire case existed as a hope that a man with 20,000 pages in the ground had not simply handed a piece of paper to a stranger in a cafe. He came home on July 3rd, and nothing, as far as anyone could ever prove, had happened. No money moved, no contact was established. Reportedly, the Libyans had never taken him seriously in the first place, because from the receiving end, an anonymous letter with a $13 million price tag and a used car advertisement as a signal reads either like a provocation by a hostile service or like a lunatic. That is the absurdity sitting underneath this entire case. Regan had built his operation carefully enough to terrify the United States government, and clumsily enough that no foreign intelligence service would touch him. The FBI could not know that. All they could see was a man who had mailed an encryption key, flown to Europe, and come back. He had 7 weeks left. He did not yet have his password. And then it got worse, because on August 1st, 2001, TRW restored Brian Regan's access to the National Reconnaissance Office's systems. The man they were building a capital case against was handed his password back. From August 6th onward, according to the indictment, he worked Interlink on almost every business day. Iraq, China, Libya, missile facilities, surface-to-air sites, surface-to-surface sites, intermediate-range ballistic missile launch preparations, a Libyan missile test range. The FBI put a camera above his desk. On August 11th, he bought an airline ticket to Switzerland. On August 15th, the camera photographed him at his workstation, pulling up classified imagery of missile facilities and writing by hand into a pad. And what he was writing down were geo-coordinates, converted on the spot into his personal code, so that a page seized from his pocket would look like a shopping list. Read that again. He was sitting inside the National Reconnaissance Office, under an FBI camera, encrypting the map references of foreign missile sites in his own invented cipher. 8 days. That is what the Bureau had left, and they knew it, because they had his ticket. Once he was on the ground in Europe with paper in his shoe and a bank address in his wallet, he was out of American jurisdiction and into a room with an intelligence officer. They also knew what they still did not have. They had no idea where the 20,000 pages were. Not one hole, not one park. If he got on that plane, they lost the case. If he never went to Europe, they lost the case. They needed him packed and moving and carrying it. On the afternoon of August 23, 2001, Brian Regan drove to Washington Dulles International Airport to catch a flight to Europe. Switzerland was the destination on the ticket, and accounts differ on whether the first leg went through Zurich or Frankfurt. He checked in. He walked to the shuttle that carries passengers out to the midfield terminals. He stepped aboard with his duffel bag. Stephen Carr stepped on after him. Carr held up his badge and, by his own account, said something close to this. "Mr. Regan, I'm with the FBI. We have a couple of questions for you." Regan did not argue. He went with them. Then they emptied his pockets and the case stopped being about a letter to Libya. In his shoe, worked into the sole, was a slip of paper with names and addresses in Europe. At trial, prosecutors described what those addresses were: diplomatic offices of China and Iraq, in Bern, Switzerland, and Vienna, Austria. According to trial coverage, he was carrying them in his wallet as well. In his wallet, there was also a short line of characters that began 5, 6, N, V, O, A, I. In his pocket, a spiral pad with 13 apparently random words, reportedly among them tricycle, rocket, glove. On an index card, 26 more random words. In a folder in his duffel, 4 sheets covered in handwritten 3-digit numbers. And in the bag with them, a handheld GPS unit, 4 blank envelopes, 3 rubber gloves, 4 finger sleeves, the kind that leave no prints and no smudges, tape, glue, garbage bags, and an NRO document listing intelligence courses. A man on his way to a European holiday carrying gloves, finger sleeves, garbage bags, a satellite navigator, the addresses of 2 hostile embassies in his shoe, and 4 sheets of numbers. Stephen Carr asked him what the numbers meant. Brian Regan said nothing. He would admit to nothing at all. Not that day. Not that year. He had built a machine that only he could operate, and he had just decided to become the only lock on it. Dan Olson got the pocket litter, and he started with the easiest thing, because the easiest thing had an address in it. The line from the wallet was enciphered with a shift of 1, every letter written as the letter after it. Undo the shift, and a string of nonsense turns into a place. Münzhof, Bahnhofstrasse 45, Zurich. That is the Union Bank of Switzerland. 2 more shifted lines pointed to Credit Suisse at Bundesplatz 2 in Bern. A man who owed $100,000 was carrying the street addresses of 2 Swiss banks in a code a schoolchild could break, in a wallet on his way to Switzerland. Olson kept going. Over the following months, he broke most of what Regan had written: the brevity codes, the substitution sheets, the notebooks. And the thing that made it possible, again, was the spelling. Olson's decrypted plaintext kept coming out misspelled, and once you accept that the man on the other end writes espionage and neutralize, the wrong answers stop being wrong. The errors became a signature that confirmed every solution. His own handwriting had already identified him. Now his own bad spelling was validating the decryption of his own secrets. One item did not fall. The 4 sheets of 3-digit numbers, groups repeating in pairs, 032, 032, 042, 042, 151, 151. Olson recognized the shape of it immediately, a book cipher, each number pointing to a word on a page, which meant there was no mathematical way in. He needed the book, and the book was in the head of a man who had stopped talking. On October 23, 2001, a grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia indicted Brian Patrick Regan on 1 count of attempted espionage. It was his 39th birthday. On February 14, 2002, the same court returned a 4-count superseding indictment, 3 counts of attempted espionage, Iraq, China, and Libya, and 1 count of gathering national defense information. And the Department of Justice announced that it would seek his execution. That decision was the government's only lever, and everyone in the case understood precisely what it was for. Because for 18 months, from the shuttle at Dulles to the opening of his trial, Brian Regan said nothing useful. He did not confirm the code, he did not name the book, he did not point at a single tree. And for those 18 months, over 20,000 pages of top-secret American intelligence sat 18 inches under the leaf litter of 2 public parks, wrapped in supermarket plastic, going soft in the rain. Every week they stayed there was a week in which a storm, an animal, or a bored teenager with a shovel could have put satellite capabilities and missile coordinates onto open ground in Maryland. The United States was now prosecuting a man for his life, in part to make him say where he had left the country's secrets. And he still had one thing left that he didn't know he had already lost. The trial of Brian Patrick Regan opened in Alexandria, Virginia in January 2003 in front of United States District Judge Gerald Bruce Lee. The government was asking for his life, not life in prison, his life. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, which made this the first capital espionage prosecution in the United States since Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, executed in 1953. The lead prosecutors were Assistant United States Attorneys Patricia Haynes and Robert Spencer, under United States Attorney Paul McNulty. The defense was led by Nina Ginsburg. Ginsburg's argument was not that her client was innocent of stupidity. It was that he was guilty of nothing else. She stood in front of the jury and called his conduct childish, unprofessional, nonsense, harebrained. Her position was that Brian Regan had fantasized about being a spy, had bungled every step of it, had never delivered a page to anybody, and that the United States was seeking to execute a man for a daydream. Patricia Haynes answered it in 8 words that the reporters in the room wrote down. Brian Regan is not a fantasizer. Brian Regan is a traitor. The jury deliberated about 24 hours over 5 days. In February 2003, they convicted him on 2 counts of attempted espionage for the offers to Iraq and to China, and 1 count of unlawfully gathering national defense information. On the Libya count, the one that had started the entire investigation, the letter the consulate source handed over, they acquitted him. Then they went back out to decide whether he would die. The death penalty turned on a single question the jury had to answer. Had he offered material concerning nuclear weaponry, military satellites, war plans, or other major American weapons systems? The jury found that he had not. They declined to return a death sentence. Brian Regan had escaped the electric chair, and he was still the only human being on Earth who knew where 20,000 pages of top-secret American intelligence were buried. That was the trade, and both sides knew it before the verdict was dry. The deal signed in 2003 gave Brian Regan life imprisonment without parole. In exchange, he agreed to full cooperation, to lead the government to every package he had buried. The government agreed not to prosecute his wife, Annette, and agreed that she could keep his military pension. He was sentenced in March 2003. Then he took them to the woods. He told them about the toothbrush holder buried under the interstate exit sign near Fredericksburg, with the master list of locations rolled up inside it. Agents dug it out. From March to June 25, 2003, dozens of FBI personnel worked 19 sites in 2 state parks, 12 in Pocahontas State Park in central Virginia, 7 in Patapsco Valley State Park above Baltimore. Hillsides, rain, ticks. Assistant United States Attorney Patricia Haynes described the excavation without any romance at all. It was horrible. There were mosquitoes, bugs, ticks, extremely hilly terrain. 18 inches down, they found garbage bags, thin plastic, Tupperware, and Rubbermaid containers, sealed and slimy, packed with paper. Over 20,000 pages classified top secret or higher, CDs, videotapes, photographs, material on American satellites, on early warning systems, on weapons of mass destruction, and, reportedly, a manual that would help an adversary hide from the very satellites the man who buried it had spent his career reading. In one of those caches, reportedly, the FBI found something that no cryptanalyst was required to interpret, a sticky note with Brian Regan's own name written on it. And then they reached the last 7 packages, and the man who buried them could not remember how to find them. These were the ones encoded in the 4 sheets of 3-digit numbers. Regan, cooperating now, gave up the book at last. It was his junior high school yearbook. The book he had chosen as the key to America's secrets was the yearbook of the school where he had been taught that he was stupid. He had built the most secure thing he owned out of the most humiliating object he possessed. And he could not use it. He had encoded those coordinates years earlier, and he had forgotten his own method. Which page, which column, which direction, which offset. The system was too clever for its own author. So Dan Olson, the FBI's codebreaker who reportedly cannot hold numbers straight in his head, sat down with the dyslexic spy who could not spell, and the two of them attacked a cipher that one of them had written, and neither of them could read. The break came when Olson managed to tie one sequence of numbers to a single letter. The letter was F, and the key was a name, Frank, written by hand under a gag photograph of a masked classmate in that yearbook. A joke caption, scribbled by a teenager on Long Island around 1976, in a book full of children who had spent years telling Brian Regan he couldn't read. That caption unlocked the last of it. Even then, some of the decoded coordinates came out wrong. The final packages were recovered by walking Regan into Patapsco Valley State Park in custody, 3 separate trips, and letting him look at trees until he recognized them. The man who could not spell had built an unbreakable code, forgotten the key, and been rescued from it by a schoolyard insult. Brian Patrick Regan is serving life without parole at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. Inmate number 41051-083. He never received $1 from Iraq, China, or Libya. Prosecutors acknowledged no secret ever reached a foreign government. Annette Regan was never charged and kept the pension. Stephen Carr closed the case he had opened with a stack of paper containing no words and spent 2 years recovering what it described. Dan Olson kept working out of the cryptanalysis unit, still taking the messages nobody else can read. Patricia Haynes got her 20,000 pages out of the mud. Nina Ginsburg saved her client's life by calling him harebrained in open court. And she was right about that, and wrong about the rest. Patapsco Valley State Park is open every day. Families walk the trails above Baltimore, past 19 filled-in holes across 2 states, on ground that held more American secrets than any hiding place in the country's history. His code was never cracked by a machine. It was cracked by a boy's handwriting in a school yearbook, and by 9 words he spelled wrong. He hid 20,000 secrets from the United States government. He could not hide the letter S.